Hello and welcome to Pittsburgh Tomorrow. I'm Donald Bonk. I'm passionate about the future. Let's take a journey there. You'll hear from Pittsburgh's most compelling leaders, thinkers, and creators, and through their imaginations and voices, we'll explore the decades to come. Welcome to a very special edition of Pittsburgh Tomorrow. I'm very grateful to have Richard Florida, influential professor, author, and urban theorist. Welcome, Richard.
It's great to be with you, Donald. Thanks for having me. And it's great to be back in Pittsburgh, if only virtually.
Yeah, well, we're happy to have you here. And, Pittsburgh's going through, as the rest of the world right now, some amazing things. But we really want to focus first on the city of Pittsburgh and your background, your what you're doing, but your connection to Pittsburgh.
Well, I moved to Pittsburgh in 1987, and I was 29 years old at the time. And it's an interesting story. I was teaching at Ohio State. I'm originally from New York, New Jersey. Mm-hmm. Teaching at Ohio State, and invited a guy out to give a lecture. I was a pretty smart, clever young faculty member. I got enough money to do a lecture series. And I invited all the eminent urbanists of the time, and they all agreed for a very small honoraria to come give a talk in my lecture series. And there was a very eminent urbanist at Carnegie Mellon at the time in what was called SUPA, the school of, now the Heinz School, the School of Urban and Public Affairs. Mm-hmm. His name was Gordon Clark. As it turns out, Gordon is now the Mackinder Professor of Geography at Oxford. Went to school, is an Australian who went to graduate school in Canada, was at Harvard, was at University of Chicago, and moved from the University of Chicago to SUPA at Carnegie Mellon. At the time, Carnegie Mellon was looking to hire a professor jointly between SUPA and architecture. Mm-hmm. And they had many eminent people out that the two departments couldn't agree on, very famous people. But architecture and SUPA are very different places. And Gordon said, why don't you come out and interview for this position? And I had always heard a lot about the Pittsburgh, so-called Pittsburgh Renaissance, and the comeback. Pittsburgh as an innovative center, an artistic center, a great city of neighborhoods. And I went out, and lo and behold, people liked me, even though I was different than anyone, because the people at SUPA were very technical and quantitative, and the people in architecture were architecturally good. I'm a qualitative researcher. I'm not a quantitative researcher. I'm not very numeric or mathematical, but they sort of liked me, and they offered me a job, and I said, yeah. At the same time, Donald, Dick Sire at the time, who was president of Carnegie Mellon, and I forget who else was involved in it, but Dick for sure. Angel Jordan was the provost. My dean was Alfred Bloomstein. Might have been the previous dean, Brian Barry, who's a very famous urbanist who had left Carnegie Mellon, I think, to go to the University of Texas at Dallas. Anyway, they had attracted a major gift from John Hines II, who was still alive, and Senator John Hines III. To establish a Center for Economic Development that would think about, because Carnegie Mellon had all of this capability in science and technology and computer science and electrical engineering, metallurgical engineering, material science, who would think about the ways to connect that to the economic future of Pittsburgh. And I was just brought in to kind of help build that as this young 29-year-old assistant professor. And I think, I didn't know what I was getting into. I was thrust into a vortex of forces that were acting on Pittsburgh in the late 80s. And that really, more than anything else, we can talk about this, maybe my growing up in Newark, New Jersey, and experiencing the civil rights movement and racial unrest, that was my early that's what convinced me to be an urbanist as a young boy. That's what operated in my head. And going to Rutgers and getting a college degree. But other than those two things, my life in Pittsburgh, where I lived for nearly 20 years, being thrust into that vortex of forces that was reshaping Pittsburgh, really shaped me as an urbanist.
Very interesting. So the power of serendipity in many cases.
Yeah, I was a young single guy. I lived in Shadyside. I could walk or bike or, take a car to university. And remember at that time, this is really interesting. Well before I rise to the creative class, SUPA was not in the building in Hamburg Hall. Oh, okay. The old Bureau of the Mines. SUPA was in a second or third floor, I forget which, but it was up the stairs in Margaret Morris and Carnegie College. Mm-hmm. So we were embedded with the arts and dance students. And I still remember my secretary. We had secretaries at the time. And my office was lined with file cabinets, because we still had paper offices. My secretary, Mary Joyce, this wonderful woman who supported a half dozen of us, would say she was always hesitant to go to the restroom because there would not only be girls from the arts and dance program changing in there, there would be boys. And everybody in the art, they didn't care. They were artists, you know. But SUPA, the point of it wasn't in computer science. It wasn't electronic. Our department was actually literally in our school at the time in the creative hub of Margaret Morrison Currency College. So quite an introduction for me to Pittsburgh.
And that's fascinating. Obviously, it played a role in your later theory. So it's just interesting that your foundational experience on a physical level was exposure to the other side of Carnegie Mellon, which not as many people think about first. Computer science, obviously, is the arts. And so, yeah, that's fascinating.
Okay. And it was, just to say, it was a long evolution from when I came to Carnegie Mellon to rise in the creative class. We're talking about, it had to be a dozen years. You know, right. It was a dozen years that I was at Carnegie Mellon before I even began to think in that way, shape, or form. So it was a long intellectual evolution, shaped by my experience in Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, for sure.
Fascinating, and that gives us a really deeper insight into your work career that followed. So you had this transformational insight around the turn of the century. And can you kind of tie that to what you've been doing since then? So you're at Carnegie Mellon. The Rise of the Creative Class becomes an international New York Times bestseller, and just maybe some of the ideas into there, but then how that's spread out over the last 20 years.
So first of all, I had written several other books that were international non-sellers, and fully expected Rise of the Creative Class to not sell other than my parents buying it, my brother, and some relatives and friends. Mm-hmm. I didn't write that book to be a bestseller. I just got really, as any musician will tell you that's had a hit, they just wrote a lot of other good songs. They just got lucky. Timing was right. The mood was right. Something happened. Somebody wrote a story on it. I got lucky. And I've written a bunch of other books since that haven't done as well. So I think I got a great stroke of luck, but shaped by Pittsburgh. So when I came to Carnegie Mellon, I was then thrust into this Center for Economic Development. I had been researching high-tech industry complexes like Silicon Valley and the Boston Route 128 and what happened in the Research Triangle. I had been studying at Carnegie Mellon with a brilliant economist named Wes Cohen, who's now at Duke. We had been studying university-industry partnerships. Mm-hmm. And we had a big grant from the Ford Foundation to study that. University industry centers, National Science Foundation Center, all the stuff that Carnegie Mellon does spectacularly well at. And at the same time, I was immersed in Pittsburgh. I was literally talking to the mayor. The mayor tells funny stories about me. Former Mayor Murphy says, he often introduces me by saying, when Richard came to our office talking about the role of universities and knowledge and innovation in these research centers, we thought he was from the moon. Like, we thought he was just completely bonkers. But I was kind of puzzling over what I think I'd call the Pittsburgh Paradox. Mm-hmm. Why, when I looked at Stanford and MIT and Carnegie Mellon, did they look like analogous institutions? Why was Carnegie Mellon producing fantastic research? It was actually maybe not at that point spinning off companies into local environment, although it was at the rate of MIT and Boston and Stanford and the Silicon Valley. But the people I was meeting at Carnegie Mellon were going to lead those companies. The head of research at Microsoft was a Carnegie Mellon guy. The head of research at Apple was a Carnegie Mellon guy. The people who were going, to what ultimately became then Google were from Carnegie. I was seeing all this flow of people, but Pittsburgh hadn't developed that high-tech industry complex. Why? Mm-hmm. So I went off to do a sabbatical at Harvard. By this time, I had gotten notorious enough. I hadn't written Rise of the Creative Class, but I was a young scholar about 38, 40, and I was invited by a very eminent guy named Harvey Brooks. Harvey was the Benjamin Franklin Pierce Professor of Applied Physics, Physics and Applied Engineering, who had really established that unit at Harvard. He was a scientist, an engineer, and gone off to establish the Program for Science, Technology, and Public Policy at the Kennedy School. Oh, okay. He had recruited the former head of NASA to join him. He had recruited the former head of science at IBM, Louis Branscombe, whose father, Harvey Branscombe, was the president of Vanderbilt. Wow. It was like a who's who of American. There were Nobel Prize winners that were populating this. And they brought me up there because they looked at Pittsburgh. And said, Florida's an interesting guy, but look at what's happening in Pittsburgh and the rise of Pittsburgh around Carnegie Mellon. Mm-hmm. Is that a case that we could use to talk about the role of science and technology, university research, to revitalize an older, Rust Belty, industrial kind of city? And I was writing up my book chapter when I, got in the story I told in Rise of the Creative Class. I read a story in the Boston Globe which said Lycos, one of the startups out of Carnegie Mellon, founded by founded by two Carnegie Mellon people, was moving to Boston. And I kind of myself said, whoa, why?
Right.
And a lot of us had paid, a lot of people in the Office of Technology Transfer and Commercialization, myself, others had paid a lot of attention to Lycos. And when we began to really dig into it, Lycos was moving to Boston to get access to a talented pool of people that they said was already living in Boston. Not just techies. There were plenty of techies at Carnegie Mellon.
Right.
There were marketing people and management people and all the people they needed to business.
The whole ecosystem necessary to grow a company.
Yeah, and that's what sort of tipped me off. And then, the story I also tell in the book, I went back to my students in the fall and I said, how many of you will live in Pittsburgh when you graduate? And only one hand went up. Right. Well, where do you want to go? I want to go to Silicon Valley. I want to go to New York. I want to go to Austin. I want to go to North Carolina. Why? Why do you want to stay in Pittsburgh? I don't like Pittsburgh. It's not for me. It doesn't fit me. I don't blah, 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 all that stuff. And then why do you want to go there? Well, because it's a place I can make friends. I could have friends. There were more people like me. And that started the train of thought. And, Herb Simon had always told me, the eminent Herb Simon, Nobel Prize winner, if you find a question nobody else asked, if you're lucky enough, go with that freaking question, Richard. So the question I said is, we've studied the location of industries and firms for a century, but we really haven't studied from an economic geography point of view or from an urbanist point of view, the location decisions of people. That was my motivating question. Why do we as people choose to live in the locations we do? And what are the factors that bear on this? And out of that, out of like 3 or 4 years of really horrific hard work, came what we now know as rise of the creative class. But it really was steeped by my experience in Pittsburgh and trying to answer that question. What happened since, I can never get away from the heartland. I went off and I lived in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. Right. That was fun. Developed my relationship with Brookings, with The Atlantic, which ultimately led to the formation of City Lab. George W. Bush got elected. An opportunity happened in Toronto. I've always liked Toronto. It's close to my wife's family in Michigan. My wife's family's in the Detroit suburbs. It came with a big research budget to move up to the Rotman School. By the way, there were Carnegie Mellon people who had been cluing me in about Rotman. I had a dynamic young leader named Roger Martin. They had hired a few people not from SUPA, not from the Heinz School, but from GSIA, what was then GSIA, the business school, now the Tepper School. So it came with a $10 million funding program for 10 years, and I couldn't turn it down. So then I ended up in Toronto, which is pretty much, in many ways it's pretty close to Pittsburgh. It's a close drive to Pittsburgh. So that's where I am now.
Fascinating. And just a sidebar, Marshall McLuhan was always a big influence on me. And, he had mentioned in some of his books, I read his writings, that Canada was a great place to look at the United States in particular, and look at ideas, because it's involved in a big part of things, but it's also removed in one layer. And
I'll tell you right now, at the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, it is surreal. It is, I've always said, quoting McLuhan, that moving to Toronto has helped me learn more about the United States than I ever thought I would. It helped because of exactly what you said. You see the two countries in sharp relief. But boy, when you look at the dysfunction in our country now, and you look at the way we pulled apart compared to the Canadians and Torontonians that have pulled together, and I just want to say this, that Toronto's a very divided country. It has a very liberal prime minister who would be very much further left than Clinton or Obama. We have a premier, which is our equivalent of a governor, who's a kind of a Trumpist populist. His brother was Doug Ford. His brother was Rob Ford, the crack mayor. Right. And we have a mayor in John Tory who wouldn't be elected in Pittsburgh. He would be a Republican. He's a conservative, the Conservative Party member, but he's a business conservative, kind of like Mike Bloomberg. And and him and the premier ran for mayor against one another. He ran for mayor against the premier's brother. They hate one another. Literally hate one another, yet everyone has worked together, and now we've almost eliminated the virus. One other thing I'll say, there's another Pittsburgh-Toronto connection that bears mentioning on this podcast and in the times we live. Toronto is now known, alongside Pittsburgh, as one of the great artificial intelligence capitals of the world, and in many respects, maybe now in some segments more than Pittsburgh, even though Pittsburgh was the birthplace, with Raj Reddy and Herb Simon and Alan Newell. There's a fellow named Jeff Hinton. Jeff was at Carnegie Mellon as a professor. He's a Brit.
Mhm.
I've never really spoken to Jeff about this, but probably under the tutelage of Alan Newell and Herb Simon and all those folks. Anyway, he's a Brit who's pretty left leaning, as many Brits are.
Mhm.
And in 1980, he saw the United States going off on a wrong track. It elected Ronald Reagan, rightly or wrongly, and more than that, he saw defense funding becoming the principal source of funding for artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
He said, before the University of Toronto was what it is today, I'm leaving the United States. I'm moving to Toronto. This one guy, Jeffrey Hinton, moving from Carnegie Mellon to the University of Toronto, created the artificial intelligence. He's an expert in machine learning, in deep learning. He and his students, who now are in all over Canada, some in Montreal, some in Edmonton, some in Winnipeg, some in Calgary.
Right.
When you hear about Canada or Toronto and artificial intelligence, it all goes back to one guy, Jeffrey Hinton, who moved from Carnegie Mellon to the University of Toronto.
That's fascinating. Just kind of that pioneer taking things that were happening in the heartland and then going up to the second heartland in Canada. Yeah. And kind of like what I think about in a century prior, people from the East Coast going to Stanford and creating another center of thought. Another center of university intelligence.
And, Toronto shows you what the heartland could be. It's a mosaic, not a melting pot. There's more than half the population was born offshore. It has a similar geography. The neighborhoods look like Pittsburgh. By the way, the neighborhoods that I live in looks like a Pittsburgh neighborhood, except the neighborhood I lived in Pittsburgh was more beautiful because Pittsburgh had more money at the time. But yeah, it does really feel like home. And, even though I would have said as a kid, I'll probably end up staying in New York or living in Boston or, maybe I'll try San Francisco. I've ended up living, when you think about it, from Ohio State at Columbus to Pittsburgh for 17 years. That's 20. And now another 13. I've lived, this is a big number, more than 3 decades of my life in the Great Lakes region of the world. Kind of amazing to me.
And you found it to be a place where reinvention is taking place, kind of the center of, Toronto has an extraordinary urban reputation. Pittsburgh has also, benefited from its rethinking, the 2009 G20 being held in Pittsburgh. So you've been in the place. It seems in a way you're a leading indicator, seems where you go or where you've been. Seems to be, you're ahead of the curve.
The funny thing about this, Donald, is if you looked at the Amazon HQ2 list, which I did with some criticism, not because I thought Amazon should look for a great city. I just didn't like the subsidy packages, the incentive packages mayors were giving out. Every city I've lived in, and this is amazing. So I was born in Newark. It was on the list. I went to graduate school in New York City, on the list. Taught at Ohio State. Columbus was on the list. Taught at Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon was on the list. Taught at George Mason and lived in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was on the list. Was a visiting professor at Harvard and MIT in Boston, was on the list. And finally, because I live in Toronto, we have a winter place in Miami Beach. And Miami was on the list as well as Toronto. So it was kind of interesting to me that I've been buffeted around in some way. The thing I will say is that Pittsburgh has been the most formative of all of them. I mean, all of the places I've lived, Newark, and kind of seeing the racial tension, making me kind of get interested in what was happening in cities. Toronto, and exposing me to the new urban crisis and the fact that this populist mayor before Trump, Rob Ford, got elected in a multicultural city, and cities have become unequal and unaffordable. But Pittsburgh's transformation has underpinned it all. I certainly wouldn't be who I am today or have done the work that I've done. I was in Pittsburgh at the right time. And the thing I think that I find interesting about Pittsburgh is, though, although I think many in Pittsburgh would disagree with me on this, I think that my work has been most influential on Pittsburgh of any place I've ever lived. Now, people would say, Florida, that's not true. But, when I was talking about the need to focus on talent, and Pittsburgh was building giant convention centers and building big stadia and focusing on industrial incentives and not really thinking about talent. And when I was saying with my students, and this was really driven by students at that time like yourself and others, saying what would make me want to stay in Pittsburgh is if the neighborhoods were brought back, and if Oakland was an exciting place, and if the neighborhoods around the university was a second downtown, and if there was this quality of place or amenities, I was really channeling them. And I think Pittsburgh has delivered on that. And I would say this: I think Toronto had the wind at its back economically,
Hmm.
But when I look at the expansion of bike lanes, the expansion of green space, the transformation of Pittsburgh has been bigger.
Mm.
Looking back in retrospect, if you said to me in 2020, looking back at Pittsburgh, would Pittsburgh look today like it does to you? I would have said, no way in hell.
Yeah.
No way in hell Pittsburgh could win, one of the best cities for bikes, one of the best cities for open space, one of the best cities for, we were all pushing for that, but we were all saying, could it ever happen?
Right.
So in many ways, I think I was lucky to be in Pittsburgh, lucky to develop those ideas. They were part of the zeitgeist, and in many ways, Pittsburgh has delivered on a lot of what I was trying to talk about and think about.
And that's why this conversation is so important. When we were thinking about Pittsburgh into the future, you probably spent more time thinking about Pittsburgh in so many different levels that to have the opportunity and to almost take this time machine and look at 2020 back. I have to admit, having been in Pittsburgh the last 13 years, I didn't think it was going to make as much a rapid progress as it has. And it's been gratifying to me personally. My questions now, though, I'm thinking, turning to the future of where we go from here. Pittsburgh has made this extraordinary progress. You were a driver. Your ideas kind of, affected Pittsburgh in ways that even you didn't anticipate. But now we're at a jumping off point. And the question I've always said about Pittsburgh, and this is just my own, having studied under you and others, I always said Pittsburgh was going to make a comeback. I knew in my bones growing up in Western Pennsylvania that all those base elements that you talked about were there. It was only a question if they could be catalyzed. The question I have is how high of a bounce, right? We've made this bounce to Pittsburgh in 2020, which is much better than it ever was. Things are going well. Obviously, COVID's a challenge. We'll touch on that. But the question is, how much further can it go? And how does that put in the context of other great cities? So with that, maybe I can segue into this question about what would make Pittsburgh the most ideal city in the world or the best city? And if you can put that in context with your other urban experiences, not only in America, but internationally.
So I think Pittsburgh's transformation is remarkable. I think it's more than either of us would have expected. And I think that's noted in the United States and globally. The fact that it was an HQ2 finalist, whether it would win, I didn't think it would win. It's too small. It didn't have the air connections. But whether or not it was recognized as one of the 20 most important headquarter cities in the United States, if not the world. So it's back. It's attracting people. It's attracting innovators. It's attracting artists. It is, Pittsburgh, to my mind, is in the same group of cities where when I was writing Rise of the Creative Class, you might have said Austin was an up-and-coming city at that point. Or 10 years ago, you'd have said Nashville. Pittsburgh is like that now, but better because it's in the Midwest. It's not in this kind of Sunbelt. So I think it's back at baseline, and I think it has a big upside. What I would pose for Pittsburgh is to be the best smaller city in the world, bar none. The best, most innovative, most inclusive, most resilient, healthiest. So back to COVID-19, Pittsburgh Medical Center, UPMC, the incredible medical complex, the focus on the health technology, sensor technology, surveillance technology, artificial intelligence technology coming out of Carnegie Mellon. Pittsburgh, the affordability of this city, the social cohesion, the way it pulled together in the wake of numerous tragedies, including the terrorist attacks on the Temple in Squirrel Hill. Look, Pittsburgh should pose a goal is to be the best small city in the world. It's not going to be London or New York,
right,
or Paris. It doesn't have to be, but it could be the best smaller city. What's the population of the metro now? Two some million.
About 2.1 or 2.1 to 2.4 million. Yeah. So
that's what, it's about 2.5 million. That's what it should be. It should be the best small metro in the world. There shouldn't be a better one. Its baseline should be, and that scale should be wonderful because, once you get to 5 million, you have to grow differently. You need to really grow around transit and trains and highways don't work and cars don't work and you get congested and you need much higher density in terms of multifamily, tower living. So I think Pittsburgh could be the best, most livable, most sustainable, and I would echo most inclusive, racially and economically inclusive. And Mayor Peduto has put a big, Bill's an old dear friend of mine from my Pittsburgh days. He's put an emphasis on inclusive innovation. I think this idea of a shared prosperity, harking back to union movement, harking back to the steel workers, harkening back to people who struggled, who literally fought pitched battles in the streets of Homestead and along the Monongahela River. I think Pittsburgh should be the model of the best the most equitable, the most inclusive, the healthiest, the safest, and most resilient small city in the world.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of this interview. Please tune in next week to hear the rest of our conversation with Richard Florida. If you like what you heard today, please click the subscribe button located just above the podcast player at pittsburghtomorrow.com. We also encourage you to share episodes on social media. And finally, we encourage you to go to the Apple Podcasts page for Pittsburgh Tomorrow and leave a review. Tell us what you think, your suggestions, and how we can improve.